All right, so you're with us here on the deep dive, and we love to go deep. And today we're going really deep on something that's absolutely fundamental to pretty much everything we talk about, and that is leadership
Leadership.
and how the best leaders how they deal with their biggest challenges.
Right. Yeah.
And for this deep dive, we're going to be using the book The CEO Test by Adam Bryant and Kevin Scherer. And it's kind of like a cheat sheet almost.
Right.
It's based on hundreds of interviews with these top leaders from all different kinds of industries.
Yeah, and what's interesting is right from the start, the book is called The CEO Test, but it's really about leadership
Right.
at its core, right? And so, our mission today is to really extract these nuggets, these actionable insights that anyone who's leading anything can take away and use, because ultimately you face your own version of these so-called CEO tests, maybe not at the same intensity, but
Whether you're leading a team of, 3 people or you're leading an entire department, you're going to run into these fundamental tests.
yeah, for sure.
And we're going to unpack a few of the key ones from the book and give you some really practical takeaways, I think.
Absolutely. And we want to go a little bit beyond just, the buzzwords and really get into some of the concrete actions and mindsets that separate those effective leaders.
Yeah. All right. So let's dive right into the first big test from the book.
Okay.
And that's, can you develop a simple plan for your strategy?
Right.
And the book makes this really compelling case that this ability to take complexity and boil it down to something simple, this is like a real superpower for leaders.
It really is. I mean, it's not about, dumbing things down. It's about clarity, right? And Kevin Scherer, from his time leading Amgen, he had this really brilliant way of getting his team to get to the heart of the matter and consistently asking two questions: what's the big idea, and so what?
Right. And then the follow-up to that is what do we do about it and what will success look like?
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's this like relentless push to get to the essence of the idea and its impact.
Right.
And he has this great analogy of a jigsaw puzzle
Oh, yeah.
where he's saying that as a leader, you need to present that picture of the whole puzzle, a hypothesis.
Yeah.
You can't just give everyone a bunch of disconnected pieces of information.
Right. Connect the dots for everyone.
Yeah. And the book gives this fantastic example of his CFO suggested that they move their manufacturing to Puerto Rico.
Interesting.
And instead of overwhelming Scherer with a bunch of data, the CFO came in and said, look, the big idea here is significant tax incentives.
Okay.
And so what is that this move could bring in financial benefits that are comparable to launching a blockbuster drug, and it's also going to decrease risk
What?
to our California operations. And, that's simplicity with impact. And it's interesting, Scherer's focus on simplicity. That's not something that he just developed overnight. This actually goes all the way back to his time on a nuclear submarine.
Oh, wow.
Talk about complex systems.
Yeah.
He had to understand all of this incredibly intricate machinery. And he said that this led him to create what he called idiot diagrams.
Idiot diagrams.
These really basic, high-level overviews to understand how things work. And it's fascinating how he applied that same principle of breaking things down to later leading a biotech giant like Amgen.
It's really insightful how it's taking a skill from a seemingly unrelated field and then applying it to be successful in a completely new one, right? And I think it speaks to how a lot of these leadership skills are actually transferable.
Yeah.
Right. The key takeaway here is that a leader has to be able to articulate a clear and galvanizing plan, that resonates with everyone in the organization, right? They need to know, where are we going? Why does it matter? How are we going to get there? By when are we going to get there? And most importantly, how are we going to measure our progress?
Right. And because without that basic clarity, the book argues that organizations can so easily become just a bunch of people working really hard,
Right.
but in different directions. And that leads to those dreaded silo behavior.
Yes, absolutely.
And Chris Brody, he was at Warburg Pincus, and he observed that so frequently CEOs, despite all their passion, they lack that really clear vision of the actual destination.
Right. Yeah. If you're not all rowing in the same direction,
Yeah.
you're just creating a lot of splashing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Sure.
And Don Nallis, who was the former CEO of Clorox, he talked about this thing that he called economic true north.
Okay.
And he said that, if the company doesn't have a defined economic true north, that can be a fatal flaw.
Right. Yeah.
And you talk about the crucial right to win.
Mm.
Does a company really have a true differentiator or a competitive advantage?
Right.
If that's not clear and simple, then, the entire strategy can kind of fall apart.
Yeah, it can be very superficial.
Yeah, and think about, McDonald's early on and their relentless focus on QCS&V, quality, cleanliness, service, and value.
Yeah.
It was so simple, it was easy to remember, and it drove, everything they did. And later their growth strategy became retain, regain, and convert.
Yeah.
Again, concise and powerful.
Absolutely.
And, coming up with this simple plan, it's not about, finding some magic formula or some template
Right.
that's going to work for everyone. It really requires that the leadership team, they invest the time to get aligned on these shared objectives and develop this really streamlined approach.
Right.
And set these really clear metrics for tracking progress.
Yeah.
And Kelly Grier from Ernst & Young, she talks about, she took her team through this intensive 9-month strategy refresh,
Whoa.
specifically to cultivate that shared understanding and to build trust through, open dialogue.
That makes sense.
And the book mentions several different frameworks for, trying to achieve this simplification and alignment. Greg Brenneman has this really concise one-page plan.
Okay.
It covers the market, the financial side, the product, the people. There's Intel's OKR's objectives and key results. And then Salesforce has their V2MOM, which is vision, values, methods, obstacles, and measures.
Right.
So, it's about finding the right structure to distill the core elements.
Yeah, absolutely. And the New York Times, their big focus on growing digital subscriptions, that's an excellent example of, a key measurable indicator of progress.
Right.
That provides that unambiguous scoreboard for everyone.
Yeah, and the book is really careful to point out that you don't want to oversimplify things.
Right.
You don't want to oversimplify to the point of inaccuracy.
Right.
You want your plan to be simple, but you want it to be right.
It's simple and right.
Which, that actually brings up a really interesting point about the career risk that can come with developing a plan that's really ambitious, but also simple. Because, it can be a lot safer to be vague.
Yeah.
To talk about your ongoing priorities.
Yeah.
Without setting specific targets.
Yep.
Because, those specific targets could be challenging.
Right.
But an effective, simple plan should make the whole team kind of gulp a little bit.
Right.
Like, wow, can we actually pull this off?
Yeah.
And then there's also, this thing that we see sometimes, and Brenneman calls it expertitis.
Expertitis.
And, these are those people who are so deep in their specific field
right.
that they sometimes struggle to see the bigger picture.
Yeah.
And then they can't articulate a simple plan,
Yeah.
that's going to resonate with everyone.
Yeah.
What seems self-evident to them is totally opaque to others.
Yeah. And Brenneman has this a great quote. He says that some CEOs, they end up giving 21 single-spaced pages of their priorities
Right.
instead of that one-page plan.
Yeah. All right. So
No.
let's say you've done the hard work. You've created your simple plan.
Okay.
It's crisp. It's clear. Everyone theoretically understands it. What's the next crucial step?
Well, the book really stresses that developing the plan is only half the battle.
Right.
The vital next step is relentless over-communication.
Right.
Andi Owen, the CEO of Herman Miller, she emphasized that she had to repeat the core message constantly.
Yeah.
Even if it felt repetitive to her, because for so many of her thousands of employees, they were hearing it for the very first time and they needed time to internalize it.
Yeah. And Christopher Nassetta, who's the CEO of Hilton Worldwide, he said the same thing. He said, as a leader of a big company, you might get tired of, repeating the same points over and over.
Yeah.
But, you have to remember that there are so many people who still haven't heard it and still need to hear it.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the big strategic points either. The book shares this really interesting anecdote about how the absence of nuts in the company kitchen led to all these rumors about potential layoffs. And it just shows that people are always looking for meaning, right? Even in the seemingly smallest events. And, Tom Lawson from FN Global, he learned this firsthand when he, came rushing into the office one day. Everyone thought that, the company was in financial trouble.
Wow.
And it just underscores that communication, even about the little stuff, really matters.
Yeah. And Stan Van Gundy, the former NBA coach, he had this great analogy about this. He said, it's like keeping all the bunnies in the box.
Bunnies in the box. I like that.
You start with everyone aligned on the priorities,
Yeah.
but then new ideas come up, people get distracted, and it's the leader's job to constantly bring everyone back.
Keep bringing them back.
Yeah. So the fundamental principle here is that what's super clear and simple in a leader's mind,
Right.
it's often anything but clear to everyone else.
Right. Yeah.
And so much of the leader's role is to drive that simplification and make sure that the plan is jargon-free
Right.
and easily understood by everyone. All right, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about another really important test
Yeah, okay.
that's highlighted in the book. This one is, can you build teams that are true teams?
Right.
And the book argues that these cohesive, high-performing teams,
Yes.
these are essential for actually executing that simple strategy that we were just talking about.
Right. A brilliant strategy. No matter how simple it is, it's going to falter without a really strong and unified team to bring it to life.
Yeah, and Kevin Scherer tells this great story about an early experience in his career
Okay.
when he was in the Navy, and he was managing the construction of the USS Memphis.
Wow.
And he admits that, early on he was really micromanaging his team,
Yeah.
but he quickly realized that to be successful, he needed to define their responsibilities really clearly
Right.
and then trust them to do their jobs.
Trust.
And the amazing thing is that they delivered the submarine on schedule and on budget.
Wow, that's great.
And then he contrasts that with his later experience at MCI, which he actually describes as the complete anti-team.
The anti-team.
Yeah, it was just this environment that was full of disharmony and intense internal competition.
Wow.
Lots of political maneuvering and even humiliation. And he found himself just totally unhappy and unproductive in that kind of toxic environment.
Right. I mean, talk about night and day.
Yeah, and so when he took the helm at Amgen,
Mm-hmm.
he was really intentional about building this new leadership team.
Okay.
And he even hosted a dinner early on where he explicitly laid out what behaviors would not be tolerated.
Like what kind of things?
Things like, getting involved in internal politics and showing disloyalty.
Right. Set the ground rules from the beginning.
Yeah, and the book points out this frustrating thing that happens sometimes where you have team members who say that they want to be a true team.
Right.
But then in reality, they engage in all this undermining behavior.
Yeah.
You get the subtle pocket vetoes and the microaggressions and the
Yeah.
hallway politics. That just erodes trust and effectiveness. And it's kind of like Tolstoy's quote about unhappy families.
Yeah.
Each dysfunctional team finds its own unique way to be unhappy.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And then there's the constant challenge of evaluating, talent that's kind of on the bubble.
Right.
These
Yeah.
individuals who meet some of the requirements, but you have some reservations about.
Yeah.
And Ron Williams, who is the former CEO of Aetna, he talks about, assessing their forward radar.
Forward radar.
So can they anticipate future challenges and can they plan accordingly?
Okay.
And Bruce Gordon, who is the former CFO of Disney Interactive Media Group, he has this really interesting concept that he calls the Golden Age test.
The Golden Age test.
Yeah, and he describes these periods in his career where every single team member was just totally aligned
Wow.
with the strategy, the goals, the values,
Yeah.
and everyone was exceptional in their role.
Right.
And the output of the team was just so much greater than the sum of its parts.
Yeah, the synergy.
Yeah. And so the fundamental question becomes, will this person contribute to us creating a golden age, or will they detract from it?
Yeah. That's a great question to ask.
Yeah. And so the message here is that, as a leader, your effectiveness is really tied to the quality of your team.
Absolutely.
You have to be really clear about what good looks like in your context.
Yeah.
And don't compromise on quality because, nobody benefits from keeping underperforming people around.
No one.
It's kind of paradoxical, isn't it? Senior executives, they're tasked with leading teams, but they're not always that great at being members of a team
Right.
themselves.
Yeah.
Their focus might be, upwards towards managing their boss
Yeah.
or downwards towards managing their direct reports,
Right.
but not so much on collaborating with their peers.
Yeah, and sometimes the way that companies structure their compensation, it incentivizes those siloed behaviors.
Yeah.
Where they're rewarding individual performance over team success. Right. And Dinesh Paliwal, the former CEO of Harman International, he really actively tried to counter this
Right.
by telling his team that, corporations are a team sport
Right.
and that individual achievements are interconnected.
Yeah. And the book, rightfully points out that you can't just take a bunch of high-achieving individuals and throw them together
Right.
and expect them to be a team.
Yeah.
You have to address things like, interpersonal tensions and unclear decision-making processes and roles and responsibilities.
Absolutely.
And Toby Litsky, who's the CEO of Shopify, he focuses on this metric of making the team tiny bit better.
A tiny bit better.
each day as the primary measure of contribution.
I love that.
Yeah, so what are the key responsibilities of a leader when they're building one of these truly effective teams?
Right.
Well, the first one is creating that environment of psychological safety.
Yep.
This is a space where people can be open and honest and even vulnerable
Right.
without fear of, getting punished. And the book talks about Kathy Savitt and her stump-a-chump culture
Stump a chum.
as an example of what not to do.
Yeah.
And then the second thing is setting clear and focused agendas for meetings.
Okay.
And Marcus Ryu really emphasizes this idea that the leader needs to facilitate discussions and drive towards decisions.
Right. Be that facilitator.
Yeah. And then it's also really important to clarify the rules of engagement.
Okay.
How are we going to debate things and how are we going to make decisions? And Carl Bass from Autodesk, he was very explicit about whether a decision was his to make
Right.
or whether it required, consensus from the group.
Okay.
And then, of course, you have to be a talent scout
Right.
and an ongoing coach for your team members. And Kevin Scherer talks about, always being on the lookout for talented people,
Right.
even if there's not an immediate opening.
Yeah.
And always building that network of potential future team members. And then finally, there's this often overlooked responsibility of grooming a successor.
Yeah.
And Scherer's experience with Bob Bradway at Amgen is a great example of this, this intentional succession planning.
Right.
And how it can have this really positive long-term impact on the organization.
Right. Stability and future success.
Yeah. And Shelley Archambault sums this up really well. She says the top 3 keys to success are the team you build, the team you build, and the team you build.
Yeah. I mean, that really drives home
Yeah.
the importance.
All right. So in this deep dive, we've really focused on 2 of these crucial CEO tests.
Right.
The ability to develop a simple and effective strategy and the ability to build these high-performing teams.
Absolutely.
And we've been drawing on the wisdom in the CEO test.
Yeah.
And I think the big takeaway is that, these aren't just these abstract theories that are only for CEOs.
Right.
These are practical principles that you can apply in your own leadership role.
Absolutely.
No matter what your title is.
No matter where you are.
Yeah. So here's something to think about.
Yeah.
Considering the teams that you're a part of right now.
Okay.
How effectively are these principles being put into practice?
Yeah.
How are you doing with that simple strategy, and how are you doing with the true teamwork?
Right.
What's one thing that you could do right now to bring more clarity or foster that stronger collaboration?
Yeah, I think these concepts are really valuable, not only for analyzing your own leadership approach, but also for just, understanding how organizations work.
Yeah.
Why some thrive, why some struggle.
And we really hope that this deep dive has given you some aha moments and some practical knowledge
Yes.
that you can put to use.
Absolutely.
And we'll be back to explore some more of these leadership tests in future deep dives.
Looking forward to it.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.